We've now been living abroad for just over 2 years now. That means 2 years in a different climate, speaking a different language, experiencing different risks, and overcoming different hardships. Life here isn't harder or more unique than life anywhere else. It's just, like I said, different. But different can be a lonely road. You see, I'll be the very first to admit that this kind of lifestyle isn't for everyone. Not everyone should move abroad. But I'd also not hesitate to say that out of all the people that have chosen not to go, more should. The importance of this global mission of spreading the gospel is something we can all agree on. It's important, it's critical, it's essential. But whose job it is to do it, this is where I find disagreement. We all agree the need is great. We all agree the workers are few. We all agree someone needs to go. But the thing I'm told again and again and again is that someone isn't me. That's someone else's job. Someone else's duty. There's a million things I wish I could say to those that feel this way. Probably because there were a million things I wish someone would have told me back when I felt this way. But if I could say one thing, just one thing, I think I'd tell them a story. I think I'd tell them the story of Babel. And this obscure story that I'm referencing is found right here in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 11, in verses 1 through 9. This story that accounts the generation of Babel. And the reason why I think this is a relevant story to consider in relation to the topic today is that the people of Babel, the generation of Babel, were given a very similar commission and command as what we are given today. They were told by God to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. That was God's command to mankind after the flood, before the flood. That was a primary objective of God after he made man. However, the men and women of Babel refused to do so. They refused to disperse across the globe. Instead, they congregated together. Now, I said this is a parallel because we too are also given an international worldwide mission. All right, not that we would multiply via procreation, but rather we would multiply through the teaching of the gospel, through the making of disciples, through the adding of lost souls into God's kingdom, that they would be saved by his grace and his mercy. So the generation of Babel was given this important command, this important commission, and they instead decided to disregard it. And there may be many different reasons for why they chose to do so, but one specific reason that's stated within this text is that they were consumed and obsessed with their own ambitions and projects. The text says that they built this magnificent city and they were in the process of constructing a mighty and high tower that would reach to the heavens and would result in them making a name for themselves. So in other words, they were distracted because of the priority they placed upon their own ambitions, their own plans, and their own projects. Instead of promoting the commands of God among them, they were busy promoting themselves. Perhaps you know the rest of the story. God comes down, he confuses their language, which kind of necessitates a division of the people, kind of clumping up with people who could speak the same language as they could, and then settling unknown territories, thus resulting in God's commission being followed involuntarily by the people of that generation. One interesting thing I want to bring up about God's commission to his people in this text is that God's command for them was to fill the earth. Now, I'm not great at geography. I'm getting better all the time, but I'm pretty sure Babel would be considered part of the earth that God wanted them to fill. So in other words, God intended for there to be some people living in the region of Babel. The problem was he didn't want everyone doing that. All right, so it wasn't a sin for some people to stay behind in that familiar territory, but it was a sin for others. It was a sin for everyone to do that. And I think a similar thing could be said of us today. We too, like the generation of Babel, were given a command to go, to leave our homes, to fill the earth with the message of Jesus, to make disciples of all nations, to preach the gospel under all creation. However, all nations, correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, all nations includes the nation that you're living in. So I believe God does not want everyone to leave their homes, because that would then be a place where the gospel is not being preached. So it's clearly not a sin for some people to decide that I'm going to stay here. I'm going to continue the work of the gospel in this area, in this region, even if it's the place that I grew up with. However, the problem with the generation of Babel is the same problem that we face, is when everyone decides to stay home. Then the commission of the Lord goes unfollowed, disregarded, and unobeyed. When everyone stays at home, then no one goes to the places where the gospel is not being preached, where there are not disciples, and where people are not calling upon the name of the Lord. And if there ever was a time where that was the case, then I think we'd have to look at ourselves and say we are just as much of a failure of a generation as what we see here in Genesis chapter 11. But the failure of Genesis chapter 11 sets up beautifully the faith and triumph found in Genesis chapter 12 in the life of one man who was given a very similar command as what we see in chapter 11, but responded so differently. And that man was named Abram, later renamed Abraham. You see, in chapter 12, verse number 1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land which I will show you." God's giving him the exact same command as he gave the past generation of Babel, to leave his home, to leave his country, to leave his family, to go to an unfamiliar place you've never been, because I told you so. And perhaps Abraham didn't need any other information from God in order for him to obey this commission that he was given. But regardless, God sends him away from his family, not just with instructions, but with promises. Promises of protection, promises of provision, but not just that, but also promises of purpose. He gives Abraham an objective, a reason to obey him, a reason to leave his family. And that is found in the very last statement of verse 3. "And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." That God's intention was to use the obedience of this man, incorporate that into his plan to bless all peoples. And I'm not sure what reasons were most persuasive to Abraham to obey God. But I got to think this one's pretty high. That when Abraham heard this, that God wanted to use his life as a means of blessing the world, even people that Abraham did not know, never met before, never heard of, even future peoples, that he said, okay, I'll do that. And that's exactly what he did. In verse number 4, "So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him." And this purpose that God gives Abraham is really what set Abraham apart from the men and women of Babel. God had a plan with the men and women of Babel. He had a purpose for them, but they decided to exalt and promote and prioritize themselves, their own name, their own plan and project above that of God's, whereas Abraham submitted to the priority and plan of God. Some of you guys might see where I'm going with this here. Jesus has given his people a similar command, a command that will require some of us to leave our country, our relatives, and our Father's house and to go to a foreign land that we have never stepped foot on. And in addition to giving us those instructions, God also gives us promises of protection and provision. Right there in the Great Commission, Jesus concludes the statement by saying, "And lo, I am with you even to the end of an age." It's a promise of provision that he gives among many others. But in addition to that, the thing that motivates me more than anything is the blessing of knowing that just as God intended to use Abraham in his plan to bless all peoples, so too he wants to use me in a very similar way. That my obedience to his call to make disciples of all nations is him incorporating my small act of service, my small life, into his plan to bless all peoples. Now, I don't pretend to be nearly as essential in God's plan as Abraham was or play as big of a role as that, but just the fact that God is inviting me to be a co-worker with him in his plan to reconcile the nations to him is amazing, and something that if all of us thought more about, I think we would have so much of a harder time saying, yeah, that's someone else's job. Yeah, that needs to be done, but someone else will do it. No, I want to do it. I want to be able to be useful to God in this way. And certainly there are so many different ways of being involved in this work of making disciples abroad. We are certainly witnesses of that. But we also need men and women who are willing to leave their country, leave their relatives, leave their Father's house, and go to a land in order to be a blessing to the people there. But that is going to require some of us to follow in Abram's footsteps and go forth as the Lord had spoken. God bless you. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you in the next video.